Welcome to GraphQL Summit Worldwide. I'm your host, Peggy Rayzis, and I lead the developer experience team at Apollo. Wherever you're tuning in from, whether it's Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, or Australia, we are so happy you're joining us for the 5th edition of GraphQL Summit. We're calling this year's conference GraphQL Summit Worldwide to celebrate the global GraphQL community, especially the people who haven't been able to join us in years past due to travel and cost. And while I definitely miss getting to hang out in person, I'm loving that this year's summit is accessible to everyone now that it's free and online. Just to put it into perspective, last year, 1,000 of us gathered in San Francisco. And this year, we're proud to host over 5,000 developers from over 122 countries, which is pretty incredible. Where are you tuning in from? If you're on Discord, drop a message in general to let us know. And if you're not on Discord, you can register to get access with the link below. We have an awesome day planned for you. And before we start the keynote, I'd like to remind everyone of our code of conduct. The next 2 weeks, we're gathering together from all over the world. And while we all share our love for GraphQL, we have different cultures. And that's why the code of conduct is so important. It ensures all of you are safe and welcome into our community, regardless of who you are, where you come from, your gender identity, religion, sexual orientation, disability status, or your race. So please take a minute to read it, even if you've attended Summit in the past, since there are new guidelines for how we communicate online. And I want to reiterate that GraphQL Summit Worldwide does not tolerate harassment in any form. If you see or hear a code of conduct violation, please report it to our moderators by tagging Code of Conduct on Discord or by emailing codeofconduct@graphql.com. We will respond promptly and prioritize the comfort of the person affected negatively by the violation. All right, we're going to jump into today's program, but stick around after the keynote because I'm going to share some tips and tricks to help you get the most out of GraphQL Summit Worldwide. So we're trying something different for this year's Apollo keynote. There's no fancy stage, no lights, no big screen. This year, we wanted our keynote to be by developers for developers. And when we were thinking about what we wanted to share with you all, the theme of developer velocity came up again and again. We all need to move fast and ship products, but the truth is it's really hard to do that during these uncertain times. I mean, we're dealing with less than ideal home offices, juggling parenting and homeschooling responsibilities, the stress of a global pandemic, and adjusting to all while trying to ship delightful experiences to our users. So it's really important that we can do more with less code and adopt tools that increase our development speed and productivity. We've been working on a lot of cool stuff at Apollo to help you do just that. So first up, you're going to learn about Apollo Studio from Product Engineering Manager Danielle. And she's going to demo some new tools to help you save time on things that you do every day, like navigating your schema, building queries, and understanding your data. Next, you're going to learn about what's new in Apollo Client 3 from developer advocate Khalil, and he's going to get you spun up on the new cache APIs that reduce state management code and help solve common use cases like pagination. And finally, you'll discover how federation can help teams compose multiple graphs from engineering manager Jesse, who leads the Apollo server team. And Jesse will share some concrete tips to help you decide when you should adopt federation. We built these tools by listening closely to the needs of our awesome community and customers. And because of that, I think you're really going to love them. Now I'm going to turn it over to Danielle so you can see them in action for yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Danielle. I'm a client developer who writes a lot of queries. And today I want to show you what it looks like to fetch data from a GraphQL API when you have a tool that's been specifically tailored for your needs. The moment GraphQL really clicks for us developers is when we write our first query, because it's at that moment that you realize how the flexibility of being able to get exactly what you asked for is extremely empowering. For the first time ever, you have full autonomy over how you get to use an API, and it sparks creativity, and you start to realize what some of the possibilities with that might be. Apollo has been helping people use GraphQL from the early days because we believe in its future at the center of application development. For years, we've been building Apollo Client and Apollo Server to help you build and scale apps with GraphQL as easily as possible. And as the number of people using GraphQL has grown, and the sheer size of the graphs being built has grown, the need for tools that grow with us as our graphs grow from proofs of concepts to having thousands of types is more important than ever. Because as graphs grow and more people start contributing to them, we quickly move away from the world of tidy examples where everything is simple to model and easy to find, and into the world of real life. As an application developer, you can sometimes be dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of types, and you don't always know where everything is because in a schema at that scale, there's simply no way to model it all in your head. The larger your graph is, the harder it is to find what you're looking for. And in addition to that, most of the tools available today to help people write queries don't actually help you do that efficiently, especially in large graphs. In fact, most of those tools are tailored for experts, where the experts already know exactly what they're trying to do when they load up. They already know exactly what syntax they're going for, and on and on. Which means that there's been this gap between who can query the graph today and who should be able to query it, because some things are just needlessly hard if you're not at that expert level. So what I want to show you all today are some new tools in Apollo Studio that we've built specifically focused on the needs of client developers and query writers. One of the best things about exposing your data as a graph is that you can force multiply what people can do with your data if you're able to make that accessible to them. And I figured, what better real-world graph for us to look at together than the GitHub GraphQL API? Because this graph is massive. There are almost 1,000 types and more than 4,000 fields. There are 28 ways you can start a query, more than 100 mutations you can make, and on top of all of that, this graph is extremely active and being changed all the time. Every couple of weeks, new things are being added, removed, and deprecated. Earlier this summer, GitHub launched a major update to their profile page, and you can even see some of the fields here that they added to their schema to accommodate that. So how do I, as someone who has a mental understanding of the GitHub data but no knowledge of their specifics, in a big graph like this, answer a question of substance? Because it's pretty easy and simple to write a little query that asks for my full name as a user, but it's much harder to start with an abstract question, like what companies are using Apollo Client, and know how to even start answering that. So now we're looking at the Studio Explorer, and the first thing that I'm going to try to do to answer this question is open up search and type company to see what we even have to work with. It looks like company is a field that's only available in a couple places at all, which is nice and simple for us. The Search and Explorer is designed to help me find type field pairs, which is important because sometimes fields with common names like email can appear across several different types, but you're only ever really looking for one of them at a time. In our case, because company doesn't appear to be very common as a name for fields, our choice is nice and simple, and we'll go through the user type. The second step of search is all about helping you find a path in your schema to get to this type field pair. Because if we actually want to add this field to our query, we need to find a way to do so from one of the query, mutation, or subscription types. This is really helpful context even when you want to select the simplest path, because if you're not given any paths at all, you're left entirely on your own to figure out what paths even exist to add this field to your query. Pathfinding is a lifesaver the moment you want to add something that's not available just 1 or 2 steps from root. So now we know we can get company information on the user type, and the company field is a user's public profile company, which will be perfect for us. And because we have to go through user now, it would probably be good if we could get some more contact information on these users. When we were looking at the changelog, I noticed that GitHub recently added this Twitter username field to organization types, and I was wondering if maybe they've added it to user as well, because if they have, that would probably be a good way for us to reach out to people. So now I'm going to command click user to open up our docs here, scroll down to the T's, and yep, it looks like we do have a Twitter username here now, which is great. And as a backup, I think I'll also add email to this query here, because we know users must have those. So now we have all the information we'll want about users. Let's go back to our original question. If we have to find company information through this user type, I think a good proxy for what companies are using Apollo Client is what users are opening issues on this repository, and then what companies do those people work for. Because if a user is coming to the repository and opening an issue, that's probably actually a sign that they're pretty engaged. So now I'm going to open up search again and look for issues on a repository. And we're going to go with the shortest path again because the schema is really nicely modeled. And then I'm going to start a new query, which will be our query for companies using Apollo Client. And I'm going to add issues to it. So now you'll see that the query builder here has created a query on the path that we selected, which was repository and then issues. And because the repository field here has two required arguments, name and owner, the query builder has filled in the variable definitions for us and used those variables with our arguments, and even started the variables JSON for us. So all we have to do is fill in our null values of Apollo Client and Apollo GraphQL, and we are well on our way. Now I imagine that the issues list for Apollo Client is actually pretty long. We can even add total count here and use our response hints to see that we almost have 3,000 issues on Apollo Client. So I know that we're going to need to paginate this list. And because I'm looking for relatively recent usage, companies that have recently used Apollo Client, I'm going to ask for the last 100 issues. And now we're ready to go down the edges to our issue type. And what we're really looking for here is the author of these issues. And it looks like author can be one of 5 different types of actors, including mannequin, which is a great name and makes a lot of sense. But what we really need is information on issues when they were opened by users. So we're going to add user here. Now that the query builder has filled in all of those fields on our path in our query for us, we can copy our fields from user in the other query, paste them here, and format this query. And now that we have 2 fully formed queries, I want to quickly point out that the Explorer helps us manage multiple queries here by keeping our active query in focus. If I put my cursor into the user query, you'll see that the run button takes on the user context and the company's query gets dimmed. And if I put my cursor back into the company's query, you'll see that the run button and the docs take on the company's query's context instead. So now let's run this query, and you'll see that within just a couple of minutes of exploration, we've managed to get a full answer to our question. And if I want to go back in time and look at previous queries that we ran, we could do that too. We could have also done this whole thing in light mode if we wanted. And there's one last thing I want to show you all. So we're all extremely used to working with query responses as JSON because you can see exactly how your query shape is mirrored, and we're used to piping our data from responses into things like front-end templates, React components, and other scripts. But there's a strong use case for being able to write queries that just browse data in place. And if that's what you're trying to do, JSON format is actually kind of cumbersome because there's a lot of white space, there are a lot of brackets, and arrays aren't really represented in a way where you could easily just compare values. So the last thing I want to show you all in the Explorer is table mode. And if I take a couple of these fields out, I get an extremely scannable list here where we can see that the list of companies using Apollo Client includes Microsoft and MessageBird. And if I scroll down to the bottom, there's HubSpot and Salesforce and even Adobe. And I'm actually going to download this response so I can share it with our team. And as I share it, I'm going to copy a link to this query and paste that in with my file so that anyone who wants to add additional metadata can do whatever they'd like. So we were able to get in and make that query in just a couple of minutes. And the magic part isn't that we were able to do something that was impossible before, it's that we were able to do it while focusing on the what of the data, not the how, which is what querying a graph should feel like. So I want to leave you all with this thought. GraphQL is for way more than just developers who want to make efficient APIs. It's for everyone. Developers who want a power tool, designers who want to know what data they can put in their mockups, product managers who want to look up usage information, support engineers who want to be able to do account ops without waiting for that next feature in the admin app. And all this tooling that I've showed you, it's merely a mechanism for discovery and what it enables you to do and what new information you can discover about your own data is what's actually going to be the really exciting part. So you all can try out Studio on your own graph by going to studio.apollographql.com. All the tools that I showed you are completely and entirely free for unlimited use, and we really look forward to hearing your feedback. And next, I'm very happy to pass the virtual mic to Khalil to show you all what's new in Apollo Client 3.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. I just want to hone in on that notion of the data graph. You'll hear us using that term, data graph, frequently at Apollo. Regardless of if we're talking about a new GraphQL server that we're testing out for a new project, or a collection of federated ones, as you'll hear from Jesse coming up, Your data graph is a collection of data, APIs, services, and the operations we can perform with your data. And by connecting to it using a client-side data graph library like Apollo Client, it could handle the entire data fetching and state management parts of your app for you. Why is this awesome? Well, there's lots of reasons, but the main reason is productivity. If Apollo Studio's Explorer tab is about discoverability and enabling everyone on your team to find things in and about your graph, then Apollo Client is about developer velocity in helping you ship products faster using the graph. Maybe you've heard, but Apollo Client 3 was released earlier this month, and we just couldn't be more excited about it. AC3 is a culmination of 55 betas, 14 release candidates, and hundreds of resolved issues and merged pull requests. As GraphQL adoption has risen, Apollo Client has become an essential part of the modern front-end tech stack. It's currently downloaded nearly 2 million times each week, and developers count on it to work and to work well. Devs have come to expect a stable, well-tested, and versatile tool that helps them work with GraphQL data effectively. With AC3, we wanted to build upon that trust we've earned from our customers and developers from the community. And we wanted to build a better version that people could continue to count on and that would serve as something we personally felt very proud of. To do that, we took our time. We spent 11 months listening to developers. AC3 is here today, not only thanks to the dedicated efforts of a fantastic client team, but it's here also as a result of you and your help. So many of you took the time to try out the betas, provide feedback, and push these new capabilities to their limits. In fact, some of these new features you'll learn about are actually things that took some time in order to bake to reach their full potential. And for that, for your contributions, we have to extend a massive thank you. Today, what you'll find in Apollo Client 3 are a lot of thoughtfully crafted new capabilities that solve real problems for GraphQL developers. Here are some of the common themes that make up this latest release. Overall, Apollo Client 3 gives developers a seamless getting started experience, fine-grained control over the cache, and it introduces new capabilities that lets you use Apollo Client as a single source of truth for all your state. Let's take a quick look at each one of these. The first one, which is a little bit of cleanup, is about the seamless getting started experience. In the past, getting started with Apollo Client could get tricky. Previously, if you wanted to get started, you had to install a bunch of base packages, plus any other packages you needed for, let's say, testing, server-side rendering, using React hooks and links. Now, you get a much cleaner, simpler install with @apollo/client. All the features and packages you need come shipped with this base install, which makes it easier for non-React libraries to import that core Apollo Client library, and it makes it easy for you to get access to those other things you need, like testing utilities, SSR, and so on. And even if you don't need everything, the install is also tree shakeable, so you can shave off some size from your bundle. The next thing we laser focused on was to give developers more fine-grained control over the cache. I like to think of working with GraphQL data on the client in 3 parts: configuring the cache, querying for data, and mutating data, and sometimes updating the cache. One of the things we take pride in with Apollo Client is giving developers an exceptional set of defaults and really reducing the barrier to entry to build apps with GraphQL. And we've seen these productivity boosts, especially with the querying experience. Developers love the ability to write a query beside your component, let Apollo Client figure out how to fetch it and cache it, and then just take that data and pass it into your components. That's awesome, and we didn't touch that. As for the configuration part, while we're happy that that default setup is really simple for developers just getting started with GraphQL, our customers and developers from the community have been helping us to identify some of their more advanced use cases, pushing client-side GraphQL usage further. We wanted to keep that beginner experience awesome, but at the same time, we're dedicated to helping every GraphQL developer with the hard problems, and we want to find ways we can help you save time. This meant we wanted to find ways to opt into things like setting default fields and type values, transforming queries, filtering data, handling pagination, and local state management. So we set out to address these concerns. But we wanted to land on something that enabled developers to accomplish their goals in the cleanest way possible. Could we solve these problems without duplicating code or introducing more work? Our answer for this is cache policies. It's a new way to configure cache behavior. Cache policies let you configure what the cache returns before a type or field is read or merged to the cache. The API is pretty light, and it introduces new patterns that can be used to address advanced use cases in a holistic way. For example, if you wanted to set a default value for a particular field on a type, that's something you could do using cache policies. In this example shown here, we set the default value of the name field on the person type to be unknown name if we've never seen it before. Otherwise, we use the value that's been assigned to it. Cache policies are also pretty versatile. They act as a single place for you to write data fetching logic that's common across components. Pagination is a great example of this. Previously in AC2, you'd have to write all the pagination code yourself, and you'd have to do it on the actual component. And depending on how many components need pagination, you could end up writing pagination logic several times over. To help you save time, we've encapsulated this complexity for you. AC3 comes with a set of pagination helpers. For example, if you want to add relay style pagination for a type, you can import the relay style pagination helper and connect it to a type policy. You could do this for several types in your app, and this really helps cut down on the amount of code you need to write. So we've got some better patterns for configuring the cache. That's fantastic. Now, moving on, handling updates. For the most part, Apollo Client does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. If you return the new data after a mutation, Apollo Client can automatically cache it for you. But for developers that need more control, like let's say you're working with heavy data sets and you want to evict and garbage collect data, or let's say you're working with complex data models and a bunch of application-specific logic dictates how the cache should change after a mutation. If that's the case, then we've got some powerful new cache manipulation APIs that should help you with that. The new cache eviction and garbage collection APIs let you keep your cache clean and snappy. You now have the ability to selectively evict data you no longer need and the ability to garbage collect anything unreachable. The addition of garbage collection is handy in Apollo Client because if deleted data is referenced from other objects, it actually maintains those references. In Apollo Client, we do this so that if that data ever gets added again, we could just quickly re-reference it and reconnect relationships. But let's just say you wanted to nuke something and you know it's never coming back. Running the garbage collection method is useful because it'll traverse through the cache and clean up all dangling references. Previously, if you wanted to interact with data within the cache directly, you had to do so within the mental model of queries and fragments. In previous versions of Apollo Client, you'd read a query from the cache using cache.readQuery and write the new query value back to the cache using cache.writeQuery. Well, not all updates fit within the conceptual model of queries and fragments. We now have an additional way to modify the cache directly. If you know what you want to change, you can specify what to modify using cache.modify. With this, we can specify a position in the cache we'd like to change, write a function, and return the new value of the items at that position. This is a lot more control for developers. So for those of you who felt it might have been a little bit awkward working in terms of queries for some updates, this approach should feel a lot more natural. So overall, how did we give developers more fine-grained control over the cache with AC3? A lot of ways. And you want to spend some time in the docs for these features, but we're really excited about these new capabilities. We'll think it'll speed you up substantially. Okay, now my personal favorite thing we improved upon in AC3 is the local state management story. We realized that state management and working with different types of state is still something that developers occasionally struggle with when designing the architecture of their applications. In this release, we're giving developers the tools to intuitively use Apollo Client 3 as a single source of truth for state. If we're talking about state, it's important to recognize the different kinds of state that Apollo client helps you work with. Remote state, this is the state that we make network requests for. This is your GraphQL data. It's the stuff that lives behind an API or within a data graph in this case. This is primarily what developers use Apollo client for, making requests for GraphQL data and then working with it on the client side. Meta state is state about state. I was actually introduced to this at GraphQL Summit last year from a talk by Jed Watson. When you perform an operation like a query or a mutation with Apollo client, we give you signaling that lets you know when your request is loading so that maybe you could display a loading spinner, and it lets you know when it's done so that maybe you could do something meaningful with that state. Typically, without Apollo client, you'd have to write this kind of signaling logic yourself. So it's really cool that this is done for us. And that leaves local state that lives on the client side only. Typically, local state starts out as some kind of state that lives as close to the component that needs it as possible. Over time, you might realize that this state needs to be accessed from other components as well. A common solution to this problem is to move that state upwards, which might mean using something like React context. This is great, but if you're primarily working with GraphQL data, there are times when you want that local state closer to your GraphQL data. Here's an example. Let's say you're trying to build a to-do list component, and it comes back with the ID, text, and completed fields. This is enough for you to display the list of to-dos, but what if you want the ability to toggle selected to-dos? To do that, we would actually need to decorate our GraphQL data, remote state, with some local state. The challenge is we also want UI reactivity. So when it changes, we want the view to re-render. How do we do that? There's a new feature in Apollo client called reactive variables, and it's specifically for this kind of use case. To solve that problem we're having, we could create a reactive variable to keep track of all the selected to-dos, then define a type policy for the to-do type that runs some code every time the isSelected field is read in order to determine if the to-do is selected or not. With this, anytime we want to query remote data and local state data, we can do that at the same time and in the same query. This is how we can keep related pieces of state as close to each other as possible. So really, you have another tool in your tool shed here for dealing with local state. Instead of reaching for React context, if you're primarily working with GraphQL data and you need globally available local state, you've got it. Oh, one other thing. Reactive variables can be imported anywhere in your code. This means that the way we perform updates is unopinionated. If you want to write your updates in functions, you could do that. If you want to organize them in hooks, that's a possibility as well. It's just a more flexible way to deal with local state in Apollo client. So you're already using Apollo client for your remote state. You're already using it for your meta state. Now, with these new local state management capabilities, Apollo client becomes your single source of truth for state management in a front-end application. So in essence, Apollo Client 3 is something we're incredibly proud of, and we're excited about it too. The team put a lot of love into it, and we just can't wait for you to try it out. So then what's next for Apollo? What are we working on now? As we move forward, we're spending some serious time on education. This means you're going to see a lot of blog posts and tutorials and courses and even training for Apollo Client 3. And we've heard you. The Apollo Client DevTools experience is due for a revamp. We've already kicked off working on this, and we're sure it's going to be an exciting improvement over the next few months. And finally, we're heavily investing in mobile. We've got some excellent full-time engineers working on both the Apollo iOS and Android experiences. And we're excited to see both of them become more aligned with the core caching concepts popular in the web version of Apollo Client. That's all for me on the Apollo Client front. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jesse to hear more about the server side of things.
Thank you, Khalil. Hi, folks. I hope everyone out there is doing really well, staying safe, and trying to look out for each other. Thank you for joining us here today. At Apollo, we have a lot of conversations with teams adopting GraphQL. And in those conversations, a really common scenario we find is that small graphs are appearing organically within organizations. we're seeing incremental adoption, a pattern which we encourage. The classic benefits that GraphQL has to offer, plus the improvements to GraphQL libraries and tooling across the ecosystem, including features like we just saw in Apollo Studio and Apollo Client, are driving this adoption. And depending on the size of these organizations, it's not uncommon for more than one GraphQL server to show up. This often happens when back-end teams who had previously created separate REST endpoints are deploying GraphQL as a remedy for duplication, while front-end teams are simultaneously introducing GraphQL for their own reasons, while simplifying Redux code, for example. These initiatives can happen separately. And disconnected graphs are a fast path, but this strategy has some drawbacks. Data might need to be intentionally duplicated across graphs, and people outside the teams might have a hard time recognizing which graph has which data. If you do split the graphs, just make sure the boss knows to find exactly the data that they need. Joking aside, we believe that these disconnected graphs have high potential to eventually bond, and we think they should. We identify one graph as one of our GraphQL principles. We have 9 other principles at principledgraphql.com, but one graph is number 1. By joining them together, we think they create more natural and more powerful experiences. Joining may happen after the 5th conversation about overlap or when there's disagreement about where something should live, but we see it happening. And that's what I will highlight for you today. By sharing what we've learned from our conversations, I want you all to be able to understand the signs that you should look for. So you know when it's time to connect those disconnected graphs. That's the when. And I want to show that Apollo has the tooling to make joining those graphs possible. And that's the how. Now, I want to emphasize, all the data in this one graph, it doesn't need to come from one place. It might, but with incremental adoption and a bottom-up approach, while designing for client needs, we've seen it happening differently, with small graphs eventually needing to join larger graphs. Apollo Federation lets us share and extend the definition of types and the relationships regardless of where the data lives or whose concern it is. And because all of those relationships are strongly typed and can be statically analyzed, we can understand when the changes to the graph compromise existing contracts. We first announced the Apollo Federation specification and Apollo Gateway in May of last year. Since then, through a lot of incredible conversations with teams ranging in sizes, including StockX, Glassdoor, Priceline, American Airlines, and more, we've been continually improving Federation and optimizing query planning to scale to large graphs with demanding needs. On NPM, the JavaScript Federation implementation is being downloaded nearly 750,000 times per week. And Apollo Gateway is at nearly 250,000 downloads per week. And usage goes beyond just one language. We've seen the Apollo Federation specification introduced into many non-JavaScript servers, including PHP, Scala, Java, Go, Kotlin, Python, Ruby, and Rust. This strong adoption across the ecosystem has cemented Federation as a best practice for teams looking to compose disconnected graphs. And composing is the key word here. This is what Federation does. It composes multiple schemas into one. And it does this using tools that Apollo has built that allow extending types safely across graph boundaries. I'm going to go through an exercise. It's going to enable 2 existing GraphQL services to play their respective parts in a single federated graph. To demonstrate this with an example organization which brings a little extra brightness to this otherwise dark year, I'm proud to announce radrainbows.com, the industry leaders in rainbow research, tracking, and analysis. Now, here's a business that deals with rainbows in a lot of their products, and they have a lot of overlapping concerns. For Rad Rainbows, the rainbow is as core to the business as the repository is to GitHub. Let's imagine that this imaginary business has a catalog team. Their responsibility is displaying rainbows for others to browse. In the course of their development, they built out a small GraphQL endpoint using TypeScript to get the listings of the rainbows to the client. Here's a simplified example of their schema. As you can see here, there's a rainbow type with latitude and longitude and a list of colors. There's a top-level query field called getRainbows, which returns a list of rainbows. Now, for any of you who are tempted to tell me, hey, rainbows don't have just one end, they have two ends with two sets of coordinates. Well, a fun but not so accurate fact is rainbows are actually tracked by the location of their pot of gold. I've got this schema running on an Apollo server instance, and I've mocked it out with some fake data. If I click into the new Apollo Studio Explorer and run a request to the rainbows field, we'll see that we found some rainbows. Cool. After sharing a link to this Studio Explorer graph on the company Slack, it spawned a conversation with another team, the iOS team. Now, the iOS team loves the catalog's colors, but they recently saw another team share their graph on Slack, the Luminosity team, who provides the measurement of how bright each rainbow is. The catalog team has decided they don't need luminosity in their client, but the iOS team is sure that in order for their users to find the raddest rainbows, they need them to know how bright they are, but they can't make two separate queries. Right now, the iOS team's query looks like the one on the left. They're getting the latitude, longitude, and the colors. They want to make the query on the right, which adds luminosity. Now, they could ask the catalog team to add it to their GraphQL server, but since the luminosity team is responsible for the data and already has a GraphQL server set up, Federation offers another option. First, though, some background on the luminosity team. They are a Ruby team who are responsible for several different styles of APIs, but recently stood up a GraphQL endpoint to serve some of their data. So let's see what a federated collaboration between these two teams looks like. I won't go into specifics here, but with Apollo Server and Apollo Federation, it takes just a few lines of code. What I need to show is applying a federated key on the rainbow type. Now, this is a lot like a primary key in a database. It uniquely defines how to fetch an instance of a rainbow. I'll go to the running application and apply this to the rainbow type definitions using the key directive. We're using a compound key of the latitude and longitude since that's how rainbows are identified. Server reloaded, and I'm going to go ahead and register this as the catalog service. I'll provide the URL endpoint for introspection during composition, and also where that GraphQL service can be accessed at runtime. And now the catalog service is federated. Now we introduce Apollo Gateway. Apollo Gateway runs in your own environment and acts as the coordinator for incoming requests. When an operation comes in, the gateway uses the relationships we've defined in the graph with federated directives to build the query plan. For example, if a client was asking for the rainbow's colors, that would only need information from the catalog service, so the gateway would make a simple fetch to that service. However, once our iOS client team starts asking for the new luminosity field, it will need to make a new plan that joins the rainbows from the catalog to their luminosity, all without any custom gateway code being written. Back in Apollo Studio Explorer, I change over to the gateway, which I already have running on port 4000 locally, And when I run the same query as before, I get the same results, just query planned by the gateway. Let's move over to the GraphQL Ruby server the Luminosity team has in place. Now, I'll note the GraphQL ecosystem in Ruby is really quite mature. GitHub, Shopify, and a lot of contributors have made this a really wonderful experience. And the Ruby Federation implementation is with huge thanks to the folks at Gusto. I've already built this server using the GraphQL gem, but here's a preview of the current Rainbow type. So the first thing you'll notice is that this isn't defined here with SDL, but instead it's written as idiomatic Ruby code. What we're aiming to do works out the same, but to help with understanding, I put up an example of what this would look like using SDL underneath. Now, the second thing to point out is we see another Rainbow type. This rainbow doesn't have colors, but like I said earlier, rainbows are core to this business, so it's not a surprise that two separate teams have already built rainbow types into their graph. To the clients accessing the graph, we only want to have one concept of a rainbow. This is like any core type, a user type, for example, in other graphs. This is a type that we can consolidate. We want to instead extend the rainbow type that lives elsewhere. The Federation gem is already installed, so I just need to make a few changes to this existing rainbow type to tie it together to the rainbow that lives in the catalog team's TypeScript server. Let's just say that we're making a rainbow connection. Okay, jumping into the Ruby code. I'll add the same federated keys we defined on the catalog, adding latitude and longitude. Next, I'll call extend type. This declares it as an extension type. Then I'll mark the latitude and longitude as external. This is necessary since they're primary keys that live elsewhere, and this service needs to understand that on its own in order to pass validation. In fact, that's the only reason they're declared here at all. I'll start this now federated service on port 4002. And then I'll register this as the Luminosity service. Once again, I'll provide the endpoint for introspection and the URL for execution. Okay, and now the Luminosity service is federated and ready to participate as the other part of our graph. Now, that step you just saw also does a validation check. I didn't mess anything up this particular time, but this is an actual error I got on a previous run when I had mismatched the keys. It's like a helpful little cloud just floated in to help me up onto my rainbow. Okay. So here's what Luminosity's SDL looks like after the change. So we now have multiple GraphQL servers of multiple different teams' concerns serving one graph to the client. If I go back to Apollo Studio, I can add the Luminosity field to the query and run the results, and see the response is fulfilled from two separate graphs. The query I just executed is exactly what the iOS client team needed. It didn't take any complex code to wire it up, just a query planner that followed the expectations defined by the federated directives. We've just enabled collaboration on types and given product teams the graph that makes the most sense for what they're building. And this is what the one graph principle is all about. Build for what your product needs, not because of the way your teams are structured or where your data is stored. As you build out your graph, Federation is one of the best tools to help you prioritize the end user's experience by designing for them, not against them. We believe it's time to federate disconnected graphs when clients are using data from different graphs, services have overlapping concepts, or more teams need to spin up GraphQL servers, but they can't keep reinventing core company concepts. And this consolidated graph is valuable not only for development, but for any human who needs to look into the graph as well. Everyone can relish in the fact that there is one notion of a rainbow, and when luminosity becomes part of the graph, it will show up exactly where everyone expects it, on the consolidated rainbow type. And since it's GraphQL, if they don't request it, they won't get it. We see a lot of value in the graph and its ability to facilitate collaboration and simplify workflows. We hope that a unified set of tools and reasoning about things in a standard way will reduce the cost of that next integration and let us focus on building product. If you think you're ready for Federation, here's what we suggest. First, try it out. Read our docs, take it for a spin. And join the Federation panel and topic rooms later today. And use Apollo Studio to manage your graph and reach out to us for guidance and help. And if you're excited about this tooling, be sure to catch Ashi's talk next week about the future of Federation. It's very exciting and so very cool. I want to thank you for following me along this rainbow. I'll leave you with a hint about where my rainbow inspiration came from, and it was from none other than Jim Henson playing the character of Kermit the Frog. And in one verse, he sings, "Someday we'll find it, that rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me." Keep an eye out for any rainbow connections you can make in your own graph. Over to you, Peggy.
Thanks so much, Jesse, Danielle, and Khalil. I'm really proud of what the Apollo community and team has accomplished over these past few months. All of these tools are basically what I wish I had 3 to 4 years ago when I first started writing GraphQL. If you have any questions about Studio, Client 3, Federation, or anything else, Apollo engineers are standing by to help you in the sponsor lounge on Discord. So now that we've heard about what Apollo has been up to, what else can you expect to learn during GraphQL Summit? Well, this week we have some awesome talks on mobile, caching, and anti-racism. There will also be panels on Federation and learning GraphQL from leaders in the GraphQL community. The following week, you'll hear talks on custom scalars, the future of Federation, auth, error handling, and defer and stream. So we have a pretty stacked lineup. And we chose our speakers because we wanted to both spotlight everything that's new with GraphQL while also hearing from new and diverse voices in the GraphQL community. So I think some of you folks may be wondering, what do I do at a virtual event and how can I make the most out of GraphQL Summit worldwide? Because honestly, after this, we're going to post all of the talks, all of the content on our YouTube. So why should you tune in live and participate? Well, over the past few months, the organizers of Summit, we've attended a lot of virtual events. And whether it was the platform or the lack of interaction, they didn't feel quite right. So we decided to host our event on Twitch and Discord because that's where developer communities hang out. And we also wanted to create spaces where community members could virtually meet and share ideas. The main space we're going to be connecting with other GraphQL developers throughout the conference is Discord. And if you need a link to the Discord, you can get it below, but you have to register first. So once you're on Discord, what's there for you? Well, we have a GraphQL channel. That's where you're going to ask questions. And maybe you've been looking for answers on server-side rendering or GraphQL security. Just ask a question in the chat. I mean, with 5,000 people, you're almost guaranteed that someone else has run into the same issue. Some of the talks throughout the weeks will have live Q&A, and you'll be able to ask questions for that in the speaker questions channel. We also have a job board. You should post if your team is hiring or if you're looking for work. And especially with COVID layoffs, it's really important that we all help each other out. And finally, you can participate in topic rooms. Now, I know this kind of sounds a little scary. You might not know what to expect, but I really do promise they will be welcoming and fun. So, what are topic rooms? They are voice and video chat rooms led by a GraphQL community member where you can meet other developers working on similar problems in a safe and welcoming environment. You can ask questions, you can screen share together, or even have an open discussion. And topics range from subscriptions to state management to GraphQL Java and more. So we're going to have about 12 pre-scheduled topic rooms. They're going to change every day. You can see the full schedule on our website. But if you don't see a topic that you like, you can actually gather a group of people together and start your own by pinging channel request on Discord. So say maybe you are a Rails developer doing GraphQL and you want to find other people who are doing something similar. Why not just post a question in the GraphQL channel, gather a group of people, and then once you have your group, you'll need to choose a moderator because each room will be required to have a moderator responsible for following the code of conduct. Finally, you can visit our sponsors. They're actually going to have voice and video chat rooms open for the entire duration of the conference. Speaking of sponsors, I would just like to give a big thank you to all of our sponsors supporting GraphQL Summit worldwide. This event wouldn't be possible without you. All of these companies, Apollo, Contentful, Fauna, Formidable Labs, Hasura, and Stackhawk, they all have dedicated rooms in Discord where you can chat with GraphQL experts at these companies. And all of these companies are building really cool stuff with GraphQL, so you should definitely stop by. That's all I've got. If you have any questions throughout the event, please ping us on Discord at Summit Organizers and we'll be happy to help. Enjoy the show and I'll see you all on Discord.